In 1919, a physician named William Whitney Christmas built a fighter aircraft whose wings were, by design, unbraced by any strut or wire. On its first flight, the wings twisted, folded, and came off. The pilot died. Christmas built a second one. The wings twisted, folded, and came off. The second pilot died. The United States Army then paid Dr. Christmas $100,000 for his revolutionary wing design. That aircraft sits at number 1 on this list. The United States has produced more aircraft types than any other nation in history. Most were competent. Many reshaped aviation itself, but scattered across the same century, in the same factories, sits a collection of American aircraft so misconceived, so poorly engineered, or so spectacularly fraudulent that they deserve their own chapter in the history of flight. Every one of them earned its place here. Number 10. Fisher EP-75 Eagle. In 1942, the United States Army needed a new interceptor. General Motors offered an interesting proposition. Rather than design an aircraft from scratch, they would build one from the best existing components already in mass production. Wings from the P-40, landing gear from the F-4U Corsair, tail from the SBD Dauntless, all powered by the enormous Allison V3420, a 24-cylinder engine that promised extraordinary performance. The aircraft was designated P-75 to invoke the famous French 75mm gun of the First World War, a symbol of victory. It was named the Eagle. American media coverage was extensive. The Eagle, when it flew, proved to be a Frankenstein assembled from parts that had never been designed to work together. Handling was poor. Spin characteristics were dreadful. Engine cooling was inadequate. The V3420 failed to deliver its promised horsepower. By the time General Motors had redesigned the aircraft for the escort role the Army now wanted, the P-51 Mustang was already dominating that mission over Europe. The Eagle was canceled after just a handful of airframes. Approximately $50 million had been spent on an aircraft the war did not need and could not use. Number 9. Bell YFM-1 Airacuda. The Bell Airacuda looked like something drawn by a science fiction illustrator with a generous budget and no engineering consultant. Twin pusher engines, gun nacelles projecting forward of the wings, each containing a 37mm cannon and a gunner. It looked futuristic. It looked purposeful. It was, in almost every measurable respect, a disaster. The pusher engines overheated constantly. The rear-mounted propellers meant that any gunner attempting to bail out of the forward nacelles was guaranteed to be killed by the propellers behind him. When the cannons were fired, the gunner's compartment filled with choking smoke. The Airacuda was therefore usually flown with the nacelle stations unoccupied. Its performance was equally uninspiring, too draggy and slow to intercept modern bombers. Poor maneuverability, and an electrical system so complex it required a dedicated auxiliary engine, which, when it failed, took out the undercarriage and the main engines with it. Only 13 Airacudas were built, that the Army got away with only one recorded fatality flying. It is one of the more fortunate outcomes on this list. Number 8. Convair NB-36H Crusader. Some aircraft are terrible because they were poorly designed. The NB-36H is on this list for a very different reason. In the mid-1950s, both the United States and the Soviet Union were investigating whether nuclear-powered aircraft were feasible. To test whether a reactor could be operated safely in flight, Convair modified a B-36 bomber into a flying testbed. The NB-36H carried an actual nuclear reactor into the air. To keep the crew alive, the shielding was extraordinary. The rubber and lead-lined crew compartment alone weighed approximately 11 tons. Every flight was accompanied by a fleet of support aircraft, including a C-97 carrying a platoon of Marines who, in the event of a crash, were to parachute to the site and attempt radiological containment, a mission that would almost certainly have been fatal. The NB-36H was also the only aircraft in history fitted with a direct communications link to the office of the President of the United States to be used in case of nuclear emergency during flight. That hotline was actually used on one occasion when a smoke marker exploded inside the reactor compartment. The incident turned out to be harmless. Between 1955 and 1957, the NB-36H flew 47 times, with the reactor operational for approximately 89 hours in the air. It never crashed. When the program was canceled, the radioactive portions of the airframe were buried. The nuclear-powered aircraft it was designed to prove feasible was never built, which on reflection was probably for the best. Number 7. Wright Flyer. This entry is going to be controversial, but by definition, the first aircraft ever built has to be, in some sense, the worst version of what came after it. The Wright Flyer flew 4 times on December 17, 1903. The longest flight lasted 59 seconds and covered approximately 852 feet. After the fourth flight, the aircraft was damaged on the ground by wind and never flew again. This was not because the Wrights had lost interest. It was because the Wright Flyer was essentially uncontrollable. The elevator was mounted at the front, dangerously close to the center of gravity, making pitch control brutally sensitive. Roll control was achieved by warping the flexible wings. The rudder was too small to counter adverse yaw. In all three axes, the Flyer was seriously unstable. The aircraft could not even take off under its own power. It required a launching rail, visible in the famous photograph. This detail is why some historians, particularly Brazilian ones, argue that Alberto Santos Dumont's 14BS, which flew without launch assistance in 1906, should be considered the first true powered aircraft. That the argument is made largely by Brazilians is, of course, entirely coincidental. The Wrights themselves held the Flyer in no particular esteem. When Wilbur was asked what they intended to do with it after 9 years of storage, he replied that they would most likely burn it. It was a dangerous, flawed, barely controllable machine. Number 6. Lockheed Martin VH-71 Kestrel. From a purely aeronautical standpoint, there is nothing wrong with the VH-71 Kestrel. It is on this list because of what it cost to not enter service. The Kestrel was based on the Augusta-Westland AW101 Merlin, a mature medium-lift helicopter that had been in service since 1987 with the air arms of 13 nations. Standard unit cost was approximately $21 million per aircraft. In 2005, Lockheed Martin won the contract to build a variant of this proven helicopter as the new Marine One presidential transport. The original contract was valued at approximately $6.1 billion. By 2009, that figure had ballooned to over $11.3 billion. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates was summoned to Congress to explain how a helicopter already in service around the world had more than doubled in cost while producing no operational aircraft. Blame was distributed generously. In 2009, President Obama canceled the program with a diplomatic observation. The existing helicopters, he suggested, seemed perfectly adequate. The 9 partially completed Kestrels were sold to Canada as spare parts for their existing fleet for approximately $164 million. That was $2.84 billion less than had already been spent on building them. Number 5. Langley Aerodrome. Samuel Pierpont. Langley was, by any reasonable measure, a brilliant man. Astronomer, physicist, secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. He built model aircraft that flew genuinely well. Encouraged by this success, he built the Aerodrome, intended to be the world's first manned-powered aircraft. It could not fly. The Aerodrome attempted flight twice in 1903, both times launched by catapult from a houseboat on the Potomac River. Both times, it plunged directly into the water. The second attempt occurred on December 8, 1903, 9 days before the Wright brothers succeeded at Kitty Hawk. Langley died in 1906. This should have been the end of the story. It was not. In 1914, Glenn Curtiss was fighting the Wright brothers' aggressive patent litigation. He came up with an elegant strategy. If he could prove that Langley's Aerodrome had been capable of flight in 1903, the Wrights' patents would be invalidated. The problem was that the Aerodrome had never actually flown. This did not stop Curtiss. With the assistance of the Smithsonian Institution, which had its own grievances with the Wrights, Curtiss extensively modified the Aerodrome, replacing the engine, altering the wings, and improving the controls. In 1914, this heavily modified version briefly lifted off the water for approximately 5 seconds. The modifications were then quietly removed. The Aerodrome was placed on display at the Smithsonian, labeled as the first aircraft in history capable of sustained free flight. The Smithsonian did not admit that this claim had been improper until 1948. It remains one of the most embarrassing episodes in American aviation history. Number 4. Lockheed XFV-12. In the early 1950s, the United States Navy wanted a fighter that could take off vertically from any ship large enough to mount a helicopter pad. 2 competing designs were ordered: the Convair XFY-1 Pogo and the Lockheed XFV-1 Salmon. Both were tail-sitters. The pilot took off pointing straight up and had to land the same way, in reverse, looking backward over his shoulder. Convair's Pogo actually managed vertical takeoffs and landings. Their test pilot, James Coleman, described the maneuvers as being extraordinarily close to the limit of what human pilots could accomplish. The Lockheed Salmon never achieved a single vertical takeoff or landing. Approximately a ton heavier than the Pogo, it lacked the power-to-weight ratio to safely attempt either. The Salmon was therefore flown throughout its testing with a fixed conventional undercarriage, a piece of equipment more appropriate to a 1920s airliner than to a supposedly cutting-edge interceptor. Kelly Johnson, the legendary head of Lockheed's Skunk Works, spoke plainly. His team, he said, had practiced landing on clouds. They had practiced looking over their shoulders. They could not tell how fast they were coming down or when they would hit. Number 3. Rockwell XFV-12. By the 1970s, it should have been reasonably safe to assume that a A prototype fighter emerging from the world's largest and most advanced aviation industry would, at minimum, be capable of flight. In 1977, Rockwell demonstrated that this assumption was optimistic. The XFV-12 was designed as a supersonic vertical takeoff fighter for the Navy. It looked genuinely futuristic. Canard layout, wingtip control surfaces, certain components had been economically sourced from other aircraft. Intakes from the F-4, cockpit, and landing gear from the A-4 Skyhawk. The concept was interesting. A system called thrust-augmented wing was designed to channel engine exhaust downward through the wing to generate vertical lift, in theory. In practice, the thrust augmentation produced approximately 30% less lift than the design calculations had predicted. This was not a small error. This was the difference between an aircraft that could hover and one that could not lift its own weight. Tethered flight trials confirmed the failure. The XFV-12 never achieved free flight. The program was terminated in 1981. Estimated total expenditure was in the range of $1 billion. The Navy issued a statement declaring that it had learned all it could from the program, which was, in a sense, technically accurate. Number 2, the Lackner HZ-1 Aerocycle. In the mid-1950s, the United States Army decided that walking into battle was philosophically outdated. What the modern infantryman actually needed was the ability to hover into combat on a personal flying platform. Several designs were proposed. The Lackner HZ-1 Aerocycle was one of them. The Aerocycle was a small platform, approximately the size of a large stepladder, powered by 2 contra-rotating rotor blades mounted directly beneath the pilot. The pilot stood on a tiny platform without a seat, roughly 4 inches above the whirling, unshielded rotors. Directional control was achieved by leaning in the intended direction of travel, essentially the operating principle of a modern Segway, with the additional feature that a fall would result in the pilot being immediately converted into small pieces. It was capable of a horrifying 75 miles per hour, which compared favorably to its rival, the Hiller Pawnee, which topped out at approximately 16 miles per hour and could be outrun by a not particularly vigorous cyclist. Testing revealed that in flight, the Aerocycle's rotors could contact each other under certain load conditions with catastrophic consequences. The Army concluded that the primary operational effect of the Aerocycle was to raise the modern infantryman a few terrifying feet above the ground, very noisily, at great expense, making him a substantially better target than he had been on foot. The program was canceled. Number 1, Christmas Bullet, which brings us back to Dr. William Whitney Christmas and to what may be the single worst aircraft ever built. Christmas was, by profession, a physician, by reputation, a self-promoter of extraordinary talent. He claimed to have invented the aileron. He claimed to have received a $1 million offer to take command of Germany's Air Force. He claimed to have received orders for hundreds of his fighters from European powers. None of these claims stood up to any serious examination. His one aircraft design, the Christmas Bullet, was based on a single revolutionary principle. The wings would not be braced by external struts or wires. Instead, they would be free to flex in flight, like the wings of a bird. This was, in Christmas's view, an enormous engineering advance. It was, in the view of every trained aeronautical engineer who examined it, catastrophically insane. The United States Army, for reasons that remain difficult to understand, loaned Dr. Christmas the prototype of its new Liberty L-6 aircraft engine, an extremely valuable piece of wartime equipment. Christmas persuaded an out-of-work pilot named Cuthbert Mills to fly the Bullet. Mills invited his mother to the airfield to watch her son fly the revolutionary new fighter. The Bullet took off. The wings twisted. The wings folded. The aircraft crashed. Mills was killed. Dr. Christmas, undeterred, built a second Bullet. Again, without Army authorization. The second Bullet took off. The wings twisted. The wings folded. The aircraft crashed. The second pilot was killed. At least on this occasion, the pilot's mother was not present. A month before the second crash, Christmas had displayed the aircraft at the New York Air Show, describing it as the safest, most easily controlled airplane in the world. He showed no visible remorse for the 2 dead pilots. He expressed no concern for having destroyed 2 prototypes of a valuable Army engine against direct instructions. Instead, he billed the United States Army $100,000 for his revolutionary wing design. The Army paid him. Dr. William Christmas died in 1960 with money in his pockets, and as the aviation historian Bill Yen once put it, blood on his hands. The real story. Look back across this list. 10 American aircraft. And there is a specific pattern here that says something about how American aviation actually worked. The failures on this list did not come from a lack of engineering talent. The same century that produced these aircraft also produced the P-51 Mustang, the B-29 Superfortress, the SR-71 Blackbird, and the F-15 Eagle. American aviation at its best has been unmatched. The failures came from somewhere else, from a wartime procurement system generous enough to fund a Frankenstein fighter assembled from other aircraft's parts, from a peacetime procurement system willing to pay billions for helicopters that never entered service, from a research culture willing to load an active nuclear reactor into a bomber to see what would happen, from a museum willing to rewrite aviation history to spite a rival, from an era optimistic enough to build a vertical takeoff interceptor its own pilots refused to land, and from a regulatory environment loose enough that a physician could kill 2 pilots with his own aircraft, bill the government $100,000 for the privilege, and die decades later a wealthy man. None of these failures were inevitable. Every one of them required someone with authority to say yes. And in the specific decades in which they were built, the American system was, for reasons both admirable and alarming, remarkably willing to say yes to almost anything. That willingness produced the Wright Flyer. It also produced the Christmas bullet. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the aircraft the United States would rather have you forget, subscribe to Veen History for more stories of the machines, engineers, and institutional decisions that shape the sky we still fly through today. Which of these 10 do you think deserves the #1 spot? Which country's worst aircraft should we cover next? Let us know in the comments.